into two separate reports, one for the Senate and one for the House. There's a lot of common issues, and I'll just refer to them when I go through it as the differences between the two. And I'm going to start with the Senate. And the first issue that we looked at with the Senate had to do with the Senate Administrators Fund. In December of '03, the Senate set up a separate bank account for lobbyist donations. Prior to this time period, they had directed lobbyists to make direct expenditures on their behalf, similar to what I'm going to talk about in the audit of the House. So they set up this, but in the Senate, they set up a bank account, and so we were able to more clearly see what actually had gone through this and what donations had been there. And the problems that we found were, of course, there's a significant dollar amount in these. Between December of '03 and June of '08, there was about $76,000 of 100 different lobbyists had given money to this fund. And the solicitation is on behalf of the Senate as a whole, not the individual members. And our concern here is a couple of different things. One is when you have the Senate soliciting contributions from lobbyists, then you have more potential for a conflict of interest, and it may actually be one. Now, what had happened here is that we actually had audited the Senate, and this question had been asked of our office during that audit, whether or not they could do this, and we had said no. So they went to the Ethics Commission and asked them about doing it. But the Ethics Commission said that they could set this up. They really don't care about the method or the fund or anything like that, but that all lobbyist donations would still have to be reported. And what we found is most were not. We took a sample of the of some of these expenditure reports and looked at them. And out of the 15 that we looked at, we found that 9 of the contributions were not reported. And the general sense is that the lobbyist considered these to not be the type of expenditures because they were not going to individual lawmakers. Instead, were going into this fund. And there was no documentation to indicate that the Senate was informing them that these were to be reported, even though the Senate itself knew that they were to be, because they did have the Ethics Commission letter. So our suggestion is, of course, they should notify the lobbyists, and in fact the lobbyists should be going back and amending their reports to show that they had made contributions on behalf of the Senate. When we looked at the spending from the fund, we also had some concerns about the way that this is done and what things are actually being paid for out of the fund. There were the retirement receptions, dinners for the senators and their staff, and Christmas parties and Christmas gifts. If, in fact, you look at the state as a whole, these types of expenditures are not acceptable expenditures on behalf of state agencies. It wouldn't, even though that the Senate does not fall into these same policies, when you look at the state as a whole, you'd find that these are not the types of things that we should be expending funds on. And so the Senate, even though they're not subject to that, certainly should be looking at prudent and necessary uses of funds. Our other problem with this was that the bank account was set up outside of the state treasurer's office, and we don't have any, there's no authority for having gone out and set up a separate bank account. State monies need to be administered by the state treasurer, and so they shouldn't have been able to do this. Now, in their responses, the Senate suggests these aren't state monies, but once they were solicited and brought in on behalf of the Senate, they became a part of Senate funds, and therefore any bank account, if they have one, should be run through the state treasurer's office. And then, of course, if you were going to have it, that we found some problems with the internal controls on it. No ledgers of the donations, no receipts issued, and the deposits were not done in a timely manner. And so there are just issues where if you were going to have this, which we think you should not have, there were issues with the way it was done. The second area that we looked at on the Senate was on employee time and leave records. And what we found is the Senate has two groups of employees. the Senate staff and the personal staff. And on the Senate staff, we really didn't have any problems with it, except for the fact that there's some documentation issues. They're not having to sign their own timesheets, and there's no review. But other than that, we didn't find significant problems there. We did find some problems with the personal staff, only because they are not required to keep detailed timesheets or comp time records. And so it's really a matter of documentation, and the two groups of employees are being treated differently. And I will say the Senate is in the process of changing all of the staff to have the same type of a system. The third area on the Senate was their capital asset records and procedures for keeping track of their assets.